In 2011, Hidetaka Miyazaki introduced us to the world of Lordran in Dark Souls, a spiritual successor to the cult hit Demon's Souls that released in 2009. Despite having a similar game released before it, Dark Souls was the game that put From Software on the map, as it was well received commercially and critically and continues to grow in popularity even to this day. The draw of the game focused on its reactionary combat that punished overly aggressive players while rewarding those who took the time to study their enemies, learn their animations, and react accordingly and timely. This was certainly the case when it came to bosses, in which players would sometimes spend hours upon hours just throwing themselves against a mighty foe only to die over and over again. That is, until that one calculated match where they best their opponent and come out feeling on top of the world. The world of Dark Souls was also beloved by many, as a complex and layered world was littered with juicy lore, incredible secrets, bonfire checkpoints, and lots of danger. Now, while he would go on to be the lead developer for Dark Souls 3, it was clear through interviews that Miyazaki was a man who didn't like to dwell on his past successes. Despite the success of Dark Souls, Miyazaki was hungry to push the mechanics and difficulty of that game further in a new setting and with new systems.
Oh, yes. Pale blood. Well, you've come to the right place.
And that is exactly what we got in 2015 with the highly praised release of Bloodborne, a Lovecraftian-inspired gothic horror adventure where the combat system of Dark Souls was taken to its next logical progression. Players traveled through the meticulously crafted world of Yharnam this time around and discovered horrifying beasts and an unmatched level of cosmic horror while engaging in vicious combat that worked at a much faster pace than its predecessors. The crutch of Dark Souls, the heralded shield, was removed in Bloodborne, and players were forced to rely on their dodging and parrying skills instead of blocking outright. This added a new level of complexity as the gun became a player's best friend because it allowed them to parry enemies to land a critical blow. Miyazaki had found a way to remove the safety net players had relied on in previous games and force them to learn a new and more engaging way to play, trusting them not to give up. In other words, he found a way to evolve the main principles of the Souls series without losing its core elements. Now, in 2019, in a world where many video game sequels are referred to as their 1.5 versions of their previous titles, From Software stands boldly again, as Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice continues the tradition of evolving the Souls formula instead of just rehashing it. With that being said, here is Shinobi Supremacy, my review of Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice. So in my reviews, I like to start with the element of the game that I think is the main focus of the title, and so with Sekiro, we have to start with gameplay. First and foremost, this game doesn't exist in a vacuum, and so it's inevitable that this game will be compared to its predecessors, so be prepared for that in any review or critique you watch. Sekiro's gameplay is an evolution of Bloodborne's in both its combat and non-combat moments. The biggest addition to moments outside of combat has to be the way you navigate the world, as this time around a grappling hook allows players to take the high ground to survey an enemy or the battlefield. Climbing to the top of a pagoda to eavesdrop on enemies or to plan out your next move is satisfying and never trivializes the game's difficulty, as many enemies are capable of attacking you even when you're higher up. It reminds me of scaling rooftops in my favorite game of all time, and for me, that's never a bad thing. The grappling ability does allow you to skip through many areas of the game much quicker without having to fight enemies, but honestly, this isn't really a new issue to the Souls series. The placement of grapple points is kind of hit or miss though. Most are smartly placed and allow the player to skip through the world with ease and get back to bosses when they just want to get to that without having to engage with the common riffraff, while other grapple points are spaced out just far enough that it makes grappling annoying because you just barely miss your mark and end up falling. But speaking of missing the mark, a lot of players will be upset with the fact that a lot of their favorite systems from previous titles have been stripped away. At the time of this video, there is no PvP systems or the ability to summon other players into your world to help you fight bosses, which was a huge staple of previous titles. There also isn't a whole host of stats for you to level up to create different builds. Now, before release, the absence of these features had me worried about Sekiro, and while I do miss the ability to summon friends, my concerns over build diversity haven't come to fruition. While it is true that there is no way to have a magic build or a different weapon type, there is still some variation here. It may not be as diverse as in previous titles, but it still exists. This is due to the inclusion of multiple skill trees that allow you to pick new perks or combat arts at the cost of experience points, as well as through varying prosthetic tools that all have a different effect in combat. You can also level up your health through collecting prayer beads, which is an item rewarded for defeating mini-bosses, and you can level up your attack stat by defeating main bosses. A sense of progression and becoming stronger is still fully present in Sekiro. But getting to what matters most, the combat system is what shines the brightest in Sekiro, and while it does have some issues, it evolves the combat formula for this genre once again. This time around, the all-important endurance bar has been replaced with a posture bar that is critical for you to manage. In any encounter, whether it be with a standard enemy, a mini-boss, or a big bad boss, your ultimate goal is to defeat them by breaking their posture. Once an enemy is posture broken, they become susceptible to a death blow, which allows you to take them out or remove a life bar if they're a boss. And by the way, the animations for these death blows are ultra satisfying. Also, if you manage to sneak up on an enemy without alerting them, you can enact a stealth death blow, and I should mention there is an emphasis on stealth this time around. In order to reach this death blow point though, you're going to have to put in some serious work. You see, your posture bar is correlated with your health bar. The less health you have, the more posture damage you take, and the slower it recovers, but this is also true for your enemies. This means that some enemies will require you to get in hits to their vitality before you can even dream of taking a serious crack at breaking their posture. And of course, the enemies aren't just going to stand there and let you wail on them, they will often deflect your attacks and counter aggressively. Not to mention, sometimes it seems like your attack distance should be just a little bit longer because there are times where you swear you connected on a hit, but you came up just short, and that never feels good. By the way, enemy attacks do a lot more damage to you than you'll be doing to them. What this means is it's critical for you to master dodging, jumping, and most importantly for this game, deflecting. Deflecting an enemy's attack and then following up with one of your own is the most critical loop of this title, as attempting to dodge or jump your way through fights will get you killed more often than not. Souls veterans will have a tough time unlearning their instinct to dodge, but just like Bloodborne taught us to not rely on a shield, Sekiro teaches us to not rely on a dodge. Now, there has been some controversy amongst the community on dodging becoming less viable, as some enemies, bosses in particular, will turn mid-animation to track your movement to secure a hit. It may feel cheap at times, and it will frustrate the hell out of you, but you have to remember this isn't Bloodborne anymore. This game forces you to learn deflection, and that adds a new level of difficulty to the formula, which makes this light years more difficult than any other previous From title. One somewhat early game boss, Genichiro, will be your first real test of deflection skills, as he is much easier when you learn to deflect his blows. They build a system that lets you kind of coast by playing it like Bloodborne at first, but then as the game progresses, they build bosses that are like walls to make sure you've learned the new style of play. And trust me, by the time you get to the final boss, you better have learned how to deflect, or you won't beat this game, you just flat out won't. You don't have to be absolutely flawless in every fight though, as your gourd, this game's version of the Estus Flask, makes a return to offset the damage you take. You can also use your new prosthetic tools in combat to help turn the tide of battle. These tools are super useful, but also not OP enough to break the flow of combat. There are a whole host of different tools, and you can equip up to 3 of them at a time after finding them in the world. Hell, you can even upgrade all of them as well. These tools range from a heavy slamming axe, firecrackers that can be used to distract enemies, and a shield that temporarily blocks, with a bunch of other options as well. You can't spam these abilities though, as each use will cost you a certain number of spirit emblems, which you can only carry so many at a time. They work kinda like Bloodborne's health files. You can keep a bunch in excess, but you can only have so many on you at a time. And you will need as many as you can get your little prosthetic hand on, because this game is seriously challenging to the point that a lot of players are going to rage quit. There's something to be said about that. If a game gets to a point where it frustrates you more than it makes you happy, you're probably better off putting it down for something else. It's these moments of pure rage-inducing anger that you probably will experience at some point in this game that really makes you miss the comfort of being able to summon a friend to help you. There is a certain flow to combat that you have to get yourself into, because if you don't, you will just keep dying over and over again. Upon death though, you do have one final chance, as a new resurrection mechanic allows you to come back to life at least once per fight, which can be super useful if you have a tough boss on the ropes and want to land a killing blow. But reviving yourself comes at a price, that being the Dragon Rod system. Once again, these developers have married mechanics and narrative together beautifully, as your ability to revive stems from your character's exposure to the all-powerful dragon's blood. Each time you revive, you call upon the blood's power, but it leaves others around you more susceptible to disease. In other words, NPCs like merchants can contract dragon rot, which can eventually kill them if you don't heal it in time and continue to revive after every single death. It also decreases your ability to receive unseen aid, which is another mechanic that can prevent you from losing half your experience and half your coins upon death. Now hopefully between the posture bars, the various combat techniques, the arm abilities, and the progression paths, you're starting to see that this game does have a lot of systems for you to interact with in meaningful ways. This, paired with the fast and acrobatic movement and demanding combat, makes this one of the most challenging but engaging games in terms of what you're doing from moment to moment. To be real with you, this game will put your ass in your lowest lows, but it will build you up to your highest highs. While the intuitive combat mechanics are the main draw of this title, Sekiro is also aided by solid visuals and music, but even more so because of its design elements. In terms of visuals, this game is consistently good throughout, but also peppers in a lot of moments that really will wow you. This tutorial fight in an open field populated with white flowers looks incredible and really sets the tone for how good this game can get visually. Another late game fight that I won't spoil here has one of the most beautiful vistas I've ever fought on, while an even later fight has a few visual moments that will blow you away despite it being a pretty easy fight. In terms of music and voice acting, we have a lot of good stuff here too, although outside of a few pieces, I wouldn't call any of this music particularly memorable. To me, that's okay though, as the music serves its purpose well. It's more reserved in moments of stealth and basic combat, but really ramps up to epic, booming pieces during intense boss encounters. What I really want to highlight in this section though is the world and level design, because as you'd expect from this developer by now, it's breathtaking, it's inspired, and it's a real treat to explore every inch of this map. The world is built around Ashina Castle, a towering fortress in the center of the map, and many of the other levels are directly connected to it. You won't start the game here though, instead you start in the outskirts and have to make your way towards it, and by extension, the other levels of the game. The world strikes a great balance between verticality and horizontality, as a lot of levels will see you moving up and down just as much as you are moving forward and backwards. The Senpal Temple is all about ascending upwards to reach the area's final challenge, while the Sunken Valley tasks you with reaching the bottom of this world in order to collect a precious item to progress the main story. The grapple ability makes navigating the verticality of this world more nuanced in a world where games are taking steps to make traversal itself more interesting. The other component of moving vertically is climbing, and this is an issue with the game, albeit a small one. During a playthrough, there will be many times when you press square to attempt to grab onto a ledge and just straight up fall. It's really finicky, and at its worst, it can lead you to fall down and take damage. Anyway, all of these areas though are distinct visually and offer new vistas and beautiful views to gaze upon, and it'll make you miss the ability to leave a message saying, "Gorgeous view ahead." That being said though, they still feel like a small piece of a bigger cohesive world, and that's something I've always loved about From Software games. The levels are varied in design, but they still feel interconnected as a believable world. And it's a world that feels alive too, and it's due to how each new level has its own enemy types. Humans, demons, and animals are included in that. Senpal Temple has monks that will beat your ass with powerful strikes from their own hands, while the basic forces at Ashina Castle will attempt to end you with traditional sword fighting. Hell, even the wildlife is out to get you in this game, and outside of the hated From Software dog enemies, you will have chameleons, monkeys, chickens, and fish. Yes, even fish will try to murder you in this game. They all want you freaking dead. I'm going to avoid talking about specific spoilers, but the big snake you see in the trailer does play a part in this game, and if you search hard enough, you'll find him where you least expect it. And honestly, this world just provides so many moments that are going to elicit an emotional response from you. Whether that is being an enemy that you thought was dead, coming back to life, different enemies fighting each other instead of you, or stumbling into what looks to be just a simple cave only to be blown away by what you find inside. There are a ton of little moments like this sprinkled throughout the entire game, and they will stand out to a lot of players, and while the combat rightfully gets focused on the most, the world design and these little moments in particular are why Sekiro is a top-notch game. By extension, this means that the level design is at a higher standard too. Each level is split up into mini levels that have checkpoints connecting them in the form of idol statues. For anyone who's played Dark Souls or Bloodborne, this will feel immediately familiar, as it's pretty much a principle taken from those games. Unlike those games though, these mini sections within levels test you in much different ways. In previous titles, a level would introduce a few new enemies and then ask you to deal with those new enemies in an assortment of different arrangements. Here though, each mini section introduces a mini boss that is sometimes optional or required for you to progress. Some are copies of earlier ones, but many times they're unique enemies with their own skill sets for you to learn and overcome. Remember, one of the greatest strengths of a shinobi is their ability to adapt to their enemy. And because of this, From can put in a ton of different enemies that have varying skills. These mini-bosses don't have the same grandiose introductions as main bosses, but they can still wreck your shit equally as easily. The game also introduces a bunch of areas where stealth can be used to take out enemies. A lot of the times this will involve clearing out a group of enemies without being detected before tackling some main foe, although it sometimes feels like enemies spot you the second you're within 100 feet of them, and that issue kills some stealth sections completely. An example of stealth would be this early game area here. Our goal is to wipe out a mini-boss, but he has a whole entourage of dudes with him, but by sneaking around and thinning the numbers, we can make the fight against him a lot easier. Either that, or you can just run in, kill the enemies, leave the area to unaggro the mini-boss, and then run back in to get a stealth death blow and then finish him off. Honestly, that is a strategy that is really useful, although it's quite cheesy. Speaking of cheese, just like previous Souls games, some fights can be trivialized if you utilize certain strategies to bait enemies, bosses especially, into certain animations, and it feels worse here than before because the game is so difficult that it's only natural for players to search for the path of least resistance. If you're playing fair though, a lot of these bosses are supremely well designed and offer up a variety of challenges for you to overcome. Some bosses are humans with ungodly speed, power, and precision, some are large hulking beasts that thrash about, and others are the now standard gimmicky fights that often plague From Software games. This time around though, these fights don't feel as gimmicky as before, as they fully commit to an interesting concept, and without giving any spoilers, my favorite of which came in about the middle of the game and involved a few monkeys. In short, many of the main bosses will test your progress in learning the standard combat system, and the ones that deviate away from that are still interesting with unique twists. The hitboxes for these bosses though are a bit of a mixed bag. Some are very precise to the point where your jaw will drop as a blade just barely misses you because of a well-timed dodge. But others feel a bit unfair. This is especially the case for beast-type bosses. Some players will notice this and be more upset about it than others, but to me, it never got bad enough to ruin the experience. The bosses were still epic showdowns that demanded my best, and like I said, it's not just bosses. The level design and the world design are at a high peak, and the sense of discovery in a From Software game is at an all-time high in Sekiro. Finally, we come to the story section of the review, and I won't be recapping or spoiling the whole thing. I'll just talk about the story structure, the story's basic premise, and some other narrative beats. In Sekiro, you play as the one-armed wolf, who is the shinobi tasked with protecting the divine heir, a child who has been gifted the blessing and curse of dragon's blood. In the early phases of the game, you learn of Wolf's upbringing and the source of your resurrection power. As you play, you are pushed towards two main story objectives. First, saving the divine heir, and second, helping him secure his wish regarding his heritage and his abilities. Unlike in its previous titles, From takes a little bit more of a direct approach with storytelling here, although don't get me wrong, it can still be pretty vague, and there's a ton of lore for you to uncover. In other words, they're more direct in telling you why you're doing what you're doing, but they leave a lot of the conflict in the background for you to discover on your own, such as the setting, the world's inhabitants, and the family drama that is driving the events of the game. It seems that the lore may be a bit more streamlined this time around, and not as obscure as in previous titles if you want to discover some of it on your own. You won't find any master-crafted direct storytelling here, but what is here reliably drives the gameplay forward and keeps the player more informed this time around, while also providing enough lore to keep those who like uncovering it satisfied. Just like in past games, Sekiro also has multiple endings. There's 4 this time around, although I think most players will have the same ending on their first playthrough. At various times throughout the story, you are given choices to make and items to discover in order to influence the ending, and this makes replaying the game a lot more attractive for most players because some bosses are exclusive to certain endings. In terms of NPCs, I'd say there aren't as many memorable ones this time around, although From will always have a tough time recapturing the magic of characters like Solaire or Siegmeyer. In fact, outside of the sculptor and maybe the surgeon, none of these NPCs are as interesting as those who have come before, and I may not even remember any of them if I didn't have to interact with them regularly. That may be subjective, but I think a lot of Souls fans would agree with me on this point, but maybe that stems from not being able to summon any of them for boss fights in the game. I also touched on this earlier, but it's important to add that From also continues to excel in linking gameplay mechanics to narrative hooks. I've already talked about how Resurrection and Dragon Rod are connected and how this provides an in-universe explanation for one of the game's biggest mechanics. Some other examples of this would be how beast enemies fear fire, and so your fire prosthetic tool is a lot more effective against them, or how when you find new skill trees, you can actually see the enemies associated with that skill tree using those abilities against you. For instance, Senpou monks are known for their ability to use their bare hands as weapons, and so the opening ability you get if you manage to find their skill tree is a combat art that allows you to strike repeatedly with your palms. It's little details like this that makes the story, the gameplay, and the world feel more connected and fully realized. And like most From Software games before it, the story takes a back seat here, but sets up and drives the gameplay sections forward. So in conclusion, Sekiro is easily my top contender for Game of the Year so far, because it just hits so many marks right while only stumbling in just a few areas. The new gameplay mechanics are the most demanding and engaging the series has seen yet. The design continues From Software's tradition of getting the little details right in order to build a huge world, and the story is a bit more forward while not compromising on a player's ability to uncover additional lore for themselves. Ultimately, your experience with this title will be dictated by how you react to the combat changes. If you never learn that deflecting is your default defense and insist on trying to dodge or jump away from everything, then you're going to have a bad time. If this is the case, when you eventually beat a boss, you'll just be glad it's over instead of it being an actual rush from the accomplishment of it all. This is easily the most soul-crushing game of the genre in terms of difficulty, and it will lead some players to check out early and cite issues like hitbox detection and tracking on attack animations as the main inspirers for their rage quit. However, when you understand that this game is an evolution of the formula and you're meant to deflect, you'll come to appreciate this game for the masterpiece that it truly is. I've mentioned a couple nitpicks throughout this video, but honestly, the only component that may ruin the experience for some players is that the difficulty level may rob them of the fun, and they may feel shoehorned into playing a certain style that they don't really like. And if that happens, those moments of victory will feel like, oh, thank God that's finally over kind of moments, instead of, fuck yeah, I won kind of moments, and that's a shame. This game is meant for an ever-growing niche of gamers who like to be challenged and experience world and combat design in this way, and I highly recommend this game to Souls veterans. For newcomers to the series, it's hard to say if this is a good starting spot or not. On one hand, you have no experience with this genre and will probably get wrecked without developing any skills in easier titles that can be transferred to this game. On the other hand though, you won't have to unlearn any mechanics like dodging all the time that you may have picked up in a previous title. Regardless of that though, this game is worth playing. It isn't for everyone, keep that in mind, and it is difficult, and you must be prepared to respect its combat system and putting in the time to learn it to truly appreciate Sekiro. But once you do, I can assure you, you will find it to be one of the most satisfying experiences that you will have in gaming in 2019. Good luck, you'll need it in order to conquer Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice. And that brings us to the end of the review. I hope you like it, and I can't wait to hear your thoughts on Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice in the comments below. Do you like the changes? Do you not like them, and why? Please, let's talk about this game. I'm obsessed with it, and I want to hear your thoughts about it, so please, let's start a discussion in those comments. Thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed the video. Consider subscribing for more. Follow me on Twitter at NopNapNarp. And as always, have a nice day and take care.